The city of New York in the 1920s was a place of contradictions, a dazzling, modern metropolis on the surface, yet underneath its glittering lights, a darker rhythm pulsed through the streets. Immigrants flooded in from Europe, seeking opportunity and escape from poverty, yet for many, the promise of the American dream collided with the harsh reality of crowded tenements, prejudice, and limited options. In this chaotic tapestry, where ambition often collided violently with survival, one young man began to carve out a path that would forever alter the face of organized crime. He was Charles Luciano, later known to the world simply as Lucky, a name that would inspire fear, respect, and myth in equal measure. Luciano did not arrive fully formed, nor did he inherit a neatly packaged destiny. Born in Sicily and transplanted to the Lower East Side, he encountered life in its rawest, most unrefined form. The streets were his first teachers, and they were ruthless instructors. Children fought to survive amid gangs, petty theft, and the ever-present threat of law enforcement or rival criminals. Yet within this struggle, Luciano observed patterns, hierarchies, and opportunities that others overlooked. He learned to read people, to anticipate threats, and to exploit weaknesses, all without a formal education or the guidance of a mentor who cared more about nurturing character than power. The allure of power in the underworld was immediate, intoxicating, and absolute. Violence, when wielded correctly, became a language of respect and influence. Money was both the instrument and the reward, flowing from bootlegging, gambling, and protection rackets. But Luciano's genius lay not in mere brute force, it was in understanding the mechanics of control. While many gangsters of his era were content to terrorize, intimidate, and dominate, Luciano envisioned something greater. He saw an empire where violence was a tool, not the end, where alliances could amplify influence and loyalty could be structured like a business. Even before he was fully known by his peers, Luciano exhibited a rare combination of charm and intimidation. He moved among the city's criminal elite with the subtlety of a chess player, noting rivalries, sensing insecurities, and seizing openings the moment they appeared. The chaotic streets of Manhattan became his proving ground, testing his ability to survive and, more importantly, to ascend. Every barroom brawl, every stolen shipment, every whispered tip from a fellow street hustler contributed to a growing understanding of power as a psychological game. Here, he learned the delicate balance between fear and respect, understanding that too much of either could be dangerous if misapplied. Yet the legend of Lucky Luciano is as much about perception as it is about action. In an era defined by prohibition, media sensationalism, and the rise of political machines, Luciano became both a product of his environment and a shaper of it. Newspapers chronicled gangland killings and police raids with a voyeuristic fascination, elevating criminals to the level of folk heroes in the public imagination. Luciano understood this dynamic intuitively. He cultivated an aura that was part charm, part menace, part mystery, never fully revealing his intentions, always keeping both allies and enemies uncertain. In the theater of the underworld, perception could be as powerful as bullets. The psychological complexity of Luciano's rise cannot be overstated. He was not merely ambitious, he was strategic, calculating, and ruthless, but also adaptive. He observed the failures of those who came before him, noting how old-world loyalties, parochial thinking, and blind adherence to tradition hampered their success. Luciano was determined to do more than survive, he sought to redefine the rules themselves. In this, he was both visionary and merciless, reshaping the chaotic criminal landscape into a hierarchy that favored intellect, negotiation, and long-term planning over impulsive violence. By the time the city had begun to recognize his name, Luciano had already begun planting the seeds of a new order. He navigated the overlapping worlds of politics, crime, and business with uncanny precision. Every alliance he formed, every enemy he outmaneuvered, was part of a larger calculus, an understanding that power was never static, that it required constant reinforcement, subtle manipulation, and occasionally, decisive force. The streets of New York were unforgiving, but for Luciano, they were also an open board on which he could play a long and complicated game, one that would culminate in the creation of an empire few could challenge. The dichotomy of his persona, amiable yet deadly, charming yet calculating, would define the mythology of Lucky Luciano for decades to come. He became more than a man, he became a symbol of both possibility and peril, the embodiment of the American underworld's potential for reinvention. In a city brimming with crime, ambition, and desperation, he stood out, not only for his audacity but for his intellect, psychological insight, and unerring sense of timing. By the end of the decade, he would no longer be just a street kid, he would be the architect of a new era of organized crime, a figure whose influence extended far beyond the alleys and docks of Manhattan, shaping the very structure of the Mafia itself. The Lower East Side of Manhattan in the early 20th century was a world apart, a dense labyrinth of tenements, narrow alleys, and bustling streets teeming with life, struggle, and desperation. It was here that Charles Lucky Luciano came of age, in a neighborhood dominated by immigrant families clinging to the hope of a better life. Italians, Jews, and other Europeans crowded the streets, their languages mingling into a constant, chaotic hum. Every day was a negotiation between survival and aspiration, a test of cunning and endurance. For a young boy like Luciano, the environment was both a crucible and a classroom. Poverty was relentless, the law often indifferent, and violence always simmering beneath the surface. Luciano's family, like many Sicilian immigrants, carried the weight of tradition and the expectation of hard work, yet they were powerless against the overwhelming pressures of the city. The tenements were overcrowded, sanitation poor, and opportunity scarce. In these conditions, children learned quickly that life was not fair, and that strength, intelligence, and cunning often mattered more than honesty or morality. Luciano absorbed these lessons early, internalizing the unwritten codes that governed survival on the streets. Loyalty could be as fleeting as a dollar earned, betrayal could come from unexpected corners, and respect had to be earned through both intellect and presence. The streets themselves became Luciano's first education in power dynamics. He observed older boys running small-time schemes, pickpocketing, stealing from pushcarts, or enforcing debts for local operators. He watched how respect was demanded, how fear could be wielded like a weapon, and how alliances were fragile yet necessary. Luciano was not content to remain a peripheral figure in these skirmishes. Even as a teenager, he demonstrated a keen eye for strategy, recognizing which relationships could advance him and which could lead to ruin. He learned to navigate the delicate balance between aggression and diplomacy, understanding that the underworld was as much a psychological battlefield as a physical one. Sicilian traditions and family influence also shaped him, but in complex ways. While many in the immigrant community clung tightly to old-world notions of honor and hierarchy, Luciano was increasingly skeptical of rigid conventions. He observed the older generation's reliance on outdated methods and realized that innovation, adaptability, and a keen sense of timing could yield greater power than blind adherence to tradition. From an early age, he displayed the capacity to merge old-world cunning with modern pragmatism, a synthesis that would later define his approach to organized crime. Education, though limited, played a subtle role in his development. While formal schooling was sparse and inconsistent, Luciano's mind absorbed the patterns of human behavior, the strategies of negotiation, and the psychology of influence with remarkable acuity. He understood that survival was not merely a matter of strength, but of perception, timing, and manipulation. Every street fight, every small theft, every encounter with authority became a lesson in reading intentions, anticipating moves, and exploiting vulnerabilities. This was the laboratory in which his intelligence was honed, far more potent than any classroom could offer. Social dynamics in the neighborhood also exposed him to the fragility and brutality of loyalty. Friends could become rivals overnight, and minor disputes could escalate into life-threatening confrontations. Yet amid this instability, Luciano cultivated a remarkable sense of emotional intelligence. He learned to gauge temperament, detect ambition, and sense fear, all while maintaining a facade of composure and confidence. The streets were chaotic, but they were also predictable in their own ways, governed by patterns of desire, fear, and survival instinct. Luciano's emerging brilliance lay in recognizing these patterns and exploiting them systematically. The influence of gang culture became particularly formative. Local gangs were small, territorial, and often engaged in petty crime, yet they mirrored the structures of larger criminal organizations. Luciano watched the interplay of loyalty, negotiation, and intimidation, taking notes on what worked and what led to downfall. Unlike many of his peers, he did not rush into violence indiscriminately. He measured, calculated, and bided his time, understanding that patience could yield far greater rewards than impulsivity. This patience, combined with his growing charisma, allowed him to navigate a dangerous social ecosystem and begin positioning himself for future influence. Meanwhile, the city itself presented both obstacles and opportunities. Prohibition was on the horizon, promising wealth for those willing to seize it, but it also promised increased law enforcement scrutiny and rival conflicts. Luciano began to sense that opportunity was often inseparable from risk, and that power was not simply granted but taken through calculated action. His environment was teaching him lessons in economics, politics, and strategy, all within the brutal framework of street survival. By the time he reached adolescence, he was already thinking several steps ahead of most peers, imagining not just immediate gains but the larger structures of control he could one day command. Family, community, and ambition intersected in shaping Luciano's moral flexibility. He witnessed the struggle of his parents and neighbors, the corrupting influence of poverty, and the allure of easy money through crime. These observations reinforced a pragmatic approach. Rules were made to be understood, interpreted, and occasionally broken for advantage. His ethical compass was adaptive rather than rigid, guided by consequence rather than principle. In this way, Luciano's Lower East Side upbringing instilled in him both the ruthlessness and the ingenuity that would later define his criminal empire. By the time he emerged from the crucible of adolescence, Luciano was no longer merely a product of the streets. He was a keen observer, strategist, and emerging leader. The streets had taught him to survive, but they had also revealed a world of opportunities for those daring enough to seize them. The Lower East Side was unforgiving, but it was also the perfect training ground for a man who would later reshape the very architecture of organized crime. In every alleyway, every crowded apartment, and every street fight, the young Luciano was silently building the foundation for a vision that was as audacious as it was inevitable, a vision that would soon challenge tradition, consolidate power, and leave a permanent mark on the underworld. By the time Luciano entered his teenage years, the streets of Manhattan had become both his arena and his classroom. Petty thefts, street fights, and small-time hustles were no longer merely survival tools. They were opportunities to understand the intricate rules that governed human behavior in the urban underworld. Luciano's intelligence manifested not in book learning but in an uncanny ability to read people, to predict reactions, and to manipulate circumstances to his advantage. While other boys his age sought immediate gratification, Luciano was already calculating the long game, understanding that power was rarely seized in a single move but carefully built, layer by layer. He became an apprentice in crime, learning from the chaotic ecosystem of gangs, corrupt cops, and opportunistic criminals that dominated his neighborhood. Some of his earliest forays into criminal activity were small, almost inconsequential: pickpocketing, breaking into storefronts, or participating in gambling games, but each act taught him lessons about risk, loyalty, and human psychology. He observed how fear could enforce obedience and respect could inspire loyalty. He saw the consequences of miscalculation, the harsh punishments meted out to those who underestimated rivals or failed to honor agreements. Every encounter was a study in the dynamics of power, and Luciano's mind absorbed it all with an analytical clarity that set him apart. Family influence continued to shape his moral compass, but his ambition increasingly diverged from the traditional Sicilian values of restraint and honor. While respect for elders and loyalty to kin remained important, Luciano quickly recognized that blind adherence to old-world codes could limit ambition. He saw older gangsters trapped by tradition, unable or unwilling to innovate, and understood that true power required adaptability. By synthesizing the cunning of his Sicilian heritage with the opportunistic pragmatism of New York streets, he began developing a philosophy that would guide him throughout his life. Rules were tools, not absolutes, and loyalty could be both earned and strategically leveraged. As he navigated adolescence, Luciano's charisma became a vital instrument. He understood that influence extended beyond the threat of violence. It was about perception, persuasion, and the ability to inspire confidence. He cultivated an aura of confidence that drew others to him, even as his reputation for ruthlessness ensured that he was not to be trifled with. Friends and allies began to emerge, drawn to his intelligence and vision, but always aware that he demanded competence, loyalty, and discretion. Luciano's social network became an early prototype of the alliances that would later underpin his criminal empire, a delicate balance of trust, fear, and mutual benefit. Luciano's teenage years were also marked by a growing fascination with strategy and organization. Unlike many of his peers, who focused solely on immediate gain, he began to conceptualize structures, hierarchies, and the management of human capital. He noticed that small gangs who collaborated efficiently, shared resources, and respected a chain of command often outlasted larger groups that relied on brute force alone. He internalized these lessons, imagining a larger framework in which criminal activity could be systematized and scaled. In many ways, Luciano's mind was already operating like a strategist's chessboard, where each pawn, bishop, and rook represented an individual, a resource, or an opportunity to be positioned advantageously. Education in the formal sense remained limited, but the streets provided a far more rigorous curriculum. Luciano studied human behavior, patterns of authority, and the psychology of intimidation and persuasion. He learned when to act decisively and when to wait, when to punish and when to reward. The ability to anticipate the motives of rivals and the desires of allies became his specialty, and he honed it through trial and error. Early encounters with law enforcement, whether bribing or evading them, taught him lessons about negotiation, leverage, and the delicate interplay between legality and opportunity. Every challenge strengthened his understanding that control could be exercised not just through force, but through intelligence and foresight. Luciano's adolescence was also punctuated by violence, both witnessed and enacted. Murders, beatings, and betrayals were a constant presence, reminding him that life in the underworld was unforgiving. Yet he never allowed these events to provoke impulsive decisions. Instead, he analyzed them, extracting insights about power, timing, and consequence. Each incident reinforced his growing belief that the weak followed rules blindly, while the strong adapted rules to serve their interests. By internalizing this brutal calculus, Luciano developed a psychological resilience that would become one of his greatest assets in the years to come. Romance, friendship, and rivalry all intersected with his criminal education. He formed bonds with peers who shared his ambition, while simultaneously cultivating a healthy suspicion of those who might betray him. Luciano learned to compartmentalize emotion, treating sentiment as a variable in the complex equation of survival and influence. He became adept at masking intentions, revealing only what served his strategy and obscuring the rest behind a veneer of charm or amiability. It was a delicate balance, but one he managed with growing expertise. By the end of his teenage years, Luciano had already distinguished himself as more than a street kid with ambition. He was a keen observer, strategist, and emerging leader, capable of understanding the subtle currents of loyalty, fear, and opportunity. His experiences had forged a mind that could operate simultaneously in multiple dimensions, anticipating rival moves, consolidating alliances, and seizing openings that others overlooked. The foundations of his later empire, the organizational brilliance, psychological acuity, and ruthless pragmatism, were already evident. In essence, Luciano's adolescence was a crucible in which intellect, ambition, and instinct converged. The streets had tested him relentlessly, yet he emerged not merely as a survivor, but as a figure primed for dominance. The chaotic energy of Manhattan had shaped his vision, instilling lessons about hierarchy, influence, and the delicate interplay of power. He had learned that success demanded both intellect and ruthlessness, that alliances could be more valuable than weapons, and that perception was often as powerful as reality. By the time he stepped fully into the adult underworld, he was ready, not just to participate, but to transform it, to impose structure, strategy, and ambition on a world defined by chaos. As Luciano transitioned from adolescence into early adulthood, the chaotic streets of Manhattan transformed from a classroom into a stage where his strategic mind could truly flourish. No longer simply a street kid surviving day by day, he began to operate with a calculated ambition, seeking not only wealth and influence but control over the very structures that governed the criminal underworld. Every action, every alliance, every act of violence or persuasion was part of a larger design, a vision that extended far beyond the narrow confines of his neighborhood. The raw energy of the streets, which had honed his instincts and resilience, now became fuel for deliberate, systematic expansion. Luciano's first major steps into the adult underworld were marked by strategic alliances and careful observation of the power hierarchies around him. He gravitated toward figures who possessed both influence and vision, learning from their successes while quietly noting their weaknesses. Older gangsters, steeped in tradition and accustomed to operating through fear and brute force, often underestimated him. Luciano, in contrast, blended audacity with patience, timing his moves to exploit gaps in loyalty, trust, and authority. He understood that in the delicate ecosystem of organized crime, one misstep could be fatal, yet one shrewd decision could elevate a person above all rivals. The early alliances he formed were crucial. Meyer Lansky, Benjamin Bugsy Siegel, and other emerging figures in the Jewish and Italian criminal communities recognized Luciano's unique combination of intelligence, charm, and ruthless pragmatism. Together, they began to envision a form of criminal enterprise that transcended ethnicity, neighborhood, and tradition. Luciano's ability to bridge these cultural and social divides was unprecedented. While most gangs operated within narrow confines, bound by ethnic loyalty and old-world codes, Luciano saw opportunity in cooperation, negotiation, and shared profit. He understood that collaboration, rather than conflict, could create unprecedented wealth and influence, and that this could only be achieved through careful management, psychological insight, and mutual trust reinforced by subtle intimidation. It was during this period that Luciano's reputation began to shift from a competent street operator to a rising strategist. He did not merely participate in criminal activity, he analyzed it, dissected it, and refined it. Each transaction, each dispute, each enforcement action became part of a growing mental map of the underworld's mechanics. He understood supply chains for illicit goods, the dynamics of local labor unions, and the importance of political connections. Corruption, he realized, was a currency as valuable as cash, capable of opening doors, shielding operations, and neutralizing threats. By thinking several steps ahead, he began to exert influence that far exceeded his immediate resources, reshaping the power landscape without needing to rely solely on violence. Violence, however, remained an essential instrument, not an end in itself. Luciano learned to wield it with precision, understanding that its psychological impact could be as valuable as its physical outcome. A well-timed act of intimidation could secure loyalty or cooperation, while excessive brutality could provoke rebellion or attract unwanted attention from law enforcement. The balance between fear and respect became a central tenet of his emerging philosophy. He cultivated a reputation that was both admired and feared, ensuring that allies trusted in his vision and enemies hesitated before challenging it. By mastering this duality, Luciano transformed himself into a figure whose presence alone could alter negotiations, alliances, and rivalries. At the same time, he began to formalize his understanding of organizational structure. Unlike older gangsters who relied on personal loyalty and brute force, Luciano envisioned a criminal enterprise with defined roles, responsibilities, and accountability. He recognized the inefficiencies of traditional mafia hierarchies and sought to implement systems that rewarded competence, incentivized loyalty, and minimized the risks associated with impulsive behavior. This approach, radical for its time, positioned him not just as a participant in crime but as an architect of its future, blending entrepreneurial vision with psychological insight. Luciano's ability to anticipate and manipulate the ambitions of others became particularly evident in his handling of rival factions. He did not confront them head-on unless absolutely necessary, instead, he studied their motivations, weaknesses, and alliances. By understanding what each person valued, money, reputation, influence, he could craft strategies that subtly guided behavior in his favor. These tactics often involved a combination of persuasion, intimidation, and calculated generosity, creating dependency while maintaining the illusion of autonomy. Over time, these methods allowed him to consolidate influence without sparking the open warfare that had destroyed many ambitious criminals before him. Political and law enforcement dynamics also shaped his strategy. Luciano recognized that his empire could only grow if he understood the levers of power outside the criminal world. Bribes, alliances with corrupt officials, and careful public image management became integral tools. He cultivated relationships that allowed him to anticipate police raids, influence judicial outcomes, and negotiate favorable terms for his operations. By integrating external factors into his calculations, Luciano elevated his approach from opportunistic crime to comprehensive, strategic governance of illicit enterprise. Even as his influence grew, Luciano remained acutely aware of the fragility of power. Alliances could shift, rivals could betray, and law enforcement could tighten the noose with little warning. This awareness heightened his psychological acuity, compelling him to maintain constant vigilance, cultivate intelligence networks, and test loyalty repeatedly. His ability to perceive threats before they fully materialized, coupled with his talent for exploiting weaknesses, enabled him to maintain momentum in an inherently unstable environment. By the end of this period, Luciano had completed the transformation from a street-level hustler into a rising strategist and visionary criminal leader. The foundations of his later empire were already in place: a sophisticated network of allies, a reputation for calculated ruthlessness, and an emerging philosophy that merged innovation, psychology, and organization. Unlike others of his era, who relied on intimidation or tradition alone, Luciano approached crime as a system, a network, and ultimately, a business, one that could be scaled, structured, and sustained. His rise was not merely a product of ambition or talent, it was the culmination of years of observation, experimentation, and strategic thinking. Luciano had learned to see the hidden architecture of opportunity beneath the chaos of the streets, and he was prepared to exploit it with precision. As he moved forward, the young strategist who had once survived by cunning and instinct was ready to dominate through vision, planning, and a ruthless understanding of human nature. The stage was set for a man who would not merely participate in organized crime, but fundamentally reshape it, creating alliances, structures, and codes that would define the underworld for decades to come. By the mid-1920s, the world of organized crime in New York was still largely rooted in old-world traditions imported from Sicily and southern Italy. Loyalties were rigid, hierarchies were inherited, and power was exercised through fear, bloodlines, and adherence to centuries-old codes. Violence was often impulsive, disputes were personal, and ambition was constrained by the expectations of a generation unwilling to challenge convention. For most gangsters of the era, the rules were absolute, and deviation carried immediate consequences. Luciano, however, was not most gangsters. He saw opportunity in the limitations of tradition, and he envisioned a system that could transcend it, a criminal enterprise organized not around fear alone, but around strategy, efficiency, and calculated collaboration. Luciano's challenge to the old mafia was both psychological and structural. He understood that fear could command obedience, but respect could create loyalty that endured beyond immediate intimidation. The older generation believed in personal authority, in loyalty tied to ancestry, in the unquestioning adherence to omerta, the code of silence that governed all mafia interactions. Luciano respected the power of these principles but recognized their limitations. Blind adherence to tradition often resulted in missed opportunities, wasted resources, and destructive infighting. He began to imagine a new paradigm, one in which power could be systematized, profit maximized, and alliances forged strategically rather than inherited or imposed. This vision required both courage and ruthlessness. To implement it, Luciano had to confront the old guard, challenge their authority, and convince a generation steeped in Sicilian values that his way was superior. He leveraged both diplomacy and intimidation, demonstrating that innovation did not threaten tradition itself but rather enhanced it, allowing for greater wealth and stability. Luciano's brilliance lay in his ability to frame his challenge not as rebellion, but as evolution, positioning himself as both a student of tradition and its necessary reformer. By doing so, he avoided alienating potential allies while simultaneously undermining the rigidity of older power structures. One of Luciano's first innovations was the concept of organizational structure akin to a business corporation. Roles were clearly defined, responsibilities codified, and communication channels formalized. Unlike older mafia families, which relied on personal relationships and informal chains of command, Luciano sought to create efficiency through hierarchy and accountability. Members could be trusted to execute plans because they understood their place within the larger system, and loyalty could be managed through both incentive and consequence. This approach dramatically reduced the chaos that had previously hampered the underworld, creating a scalable model for power that was unprecedented in American organized crime. Luciano also redefined the idea of alliances. Whereas the older mafia had largely operated within ethnic or family-based silos, he recognized the potential of collaboration across ethnic and cultural lines. Jews, Italians, and other immigrant groups could pool resources, share intelligence, and coordinate activities to maximize profit and minimize risk. Luciano's ability to bridge these divides relied on both charisma and psychological insight. He understood that while fear could coerce compliance, respect and shared interest could secure voluntary cooperation. Through subtle negotiation, mutual benefit, and strategic concessions, he created coalitions that were stronger than the sum of their parts, alliances that would form the backbone of his empire. Innovation in operations extended to the very nature of crime itself. Luciano approached bootlegging, gambling, and labor racketeering not as isolated schemes but as integrated enterprises, each reinforcing the other. Money, influence, and control were treated as interconnected assets rather than fleeting gains. He applied strategic thinking to every operation, measuring risk, anticipating law enforcement responses, and preparing contingencies for rival interference. The Mafia, under Luciano's vision, became not just a criminal syndicate but a sophisticated, profit-driven organization, capable of adapting to changing circumstances with speed and precision. Psychologically, Luciano's approach was revolutionary. He understood that power was maintained as much through perception as through action. A well-timed demonstration of force could intimidate rivals, while strategic generosity could solidify loyalty. Silence, patience, and timing became weapons as potent as guns or knives. He also recognized the importance of reputation in both the criminal world and the public sphere, cultivating an image that balanced charm, intelligence, and a subtle menace. By managing perception, he could manipulate both allies and enemies, maintaining the appearance of control even when navigating uncertainty. Challenging tradition also meant confronting resistance. Older dons who refused to adapt posed threats, not only to Luciano's ambitions but to the stability of the larger underworld. Some resisted openly, demanding adherence to the old codes, others plotted in secret, seeking to undermine his influence. Luciano's response was always calculated. He neutralized threats with a combination of diplomacy, strategic violence, and political maneuvering. Rivals who could be integrated into his system were co-opted, those who could not were eliminated or marginalized. This dual approach of inclusion and suppression ensured both efficiency and loyalty, reinforcing his emerging vision of a modernized mafia. By the late 1920s, Luciano had effectively established the foundation of the new mafia. Unlike the chaotic, fragmented, and tradition-bound world that had preceded him, this new model emphasized strategy, collaboration, and long-term profitability. Power was no longer simply the product of fear or birthright, it was a system that could be engineered, expanded, and maintained through intelligence, structure, and psychological insight. Luciano's genius lay not only in recognizing the potential for such an organization but in executing it with precision, patience, and relentless ambition. In challenging the old ways, Luciano had done more than consolidate his own power, he had redefined the very nature of organized crime in America. His model would influence generations of criminals, setting the stage for the creation of the Commission and the rise of a nationwide syndicate that operated with both discipline and cunning. In this period, he was not merely a rising gangster, he was a revolutionary, reshaping a centuries-old institution into a modern empire, one that blended tradition with innovation, fear with respect, and chaos with order. With the foundations of a modernized mafia in place, Luciano turned his attention to the machinery of wealth itself. Crime was no longer simply a matter of survival or reputation, it had become an enterprise, a sophisticated system that could be scaled, optimized, and protected. Luciano understood that power without money was fragile, and that influence was only sustainable when reinforced by tangible resources. Bootlegging, gambling, and labor racketeering were no longer isolated schemes carried out haphazardly by street crews. Under his vision, they became interconnected networks of profit and control, each feeding into the other, each strengthening the reach of his growing empire. Prohibition was both a curse and an opportunity, and Luciano exploited it with unmatched precision. While countless criminals scrambled to exploit the black market demand for alcohol, Luciano approached it like a business strategist. He built supply chains, negotiated with suppliers, and coordinated distribution with a focus on minimizing conflict and maximizing efficiency. Violence was deployed selectively, reserved for rivals who threatened his operations or undermined alliances. By combining calculated intimidation with sophisticated logistics, he transformed bootlegging from a chaotic scramble into a highly profitable, disciplined enterprise. Gambling presented another opportunity, and Luciano approached it with the same systematic vision. Unlike earlier gangsters who viewed games of chance as simple revenue streams, he understood that controlling gambling required both infrastructure and psychology. Casinos, card rooms, and betting parlors became extensions of his influence, regulated through loyalty, fear, and subtle manipulation. By controlling not only the money but the players and operators, he ensured that every gambling operation reinforced his authority, generating revenue while maintaining control over social and criminal networks. The business of chance was no longer random, it was carefully engineered to produce predictable advantage. Labor racketeering, often overlooked by smaller gangs, became a cornerstone of Luciano's strategy. He understood that controlling unions, strikes, and labor contracts offered leverage far beyond immediate financial gain. Through a combination of bribery, intimidation, and strategic influence, Luciano's network could manipulate entire industries, extract concessions from employers, and consolidate economic power that rivaled legitimate businessmen. This approach demonstrated his capacity to integrate disparate operations into a cohesive empire, one where money, influence, and control were mutually reinforcing rather than isolated. Luciano's genius was not merely operational but deeply psychological. He recognized that control required more than resources, it required managing perception, expectation, and behavior. Allies needed reassurance, rivals needed uncertainty, and subordinates needed motivation. He carefully calibrated gestures of generosity and punishment, praise and intimidation, to create loyalty without stifling ambition. Each action, whether a subtle incentive or a public show of force, reinforced the social architecture of his empire, ensuring that everyone knew their place, understood the consequences of betrayal, and recognized the advantages of alignment with his vision. The Mafia under Luciano became a network of interdependent enterprises, each contributing to the stability and profitability of the whole. Operations were compartmentalized but coordinated, allowing for rapid expansion while minimizing vulnerability. Intelligence gathering became a formalized function, with informants, insiders, and allies providing real-time insights into rival activity, law enforcement movements, and market opportunities. By treating crime as a complex system rather than a series of disconnected acts, Luciano elevated the underworld to a level of sophistication previously unseen in American organized crime. Political influence further extended the reach of his criminal ventures. Luciano understood that wealth alone could not guarantee security, it needed to be paired with protection from legal interference. Through bribes, favors, and strategic alliances with politicians and law enforcement officials, he created a buffer against prosecution and a channel to influence decisions affecting his operations. These relationships were carefully managed, ensuring discretion, loyalty, and the appearance of legitimacy. Luciano's understanding of the interplay between crime, politics, and perception allowed him to operate with an agility that rivaled legitimate businessmen while retaining the ruthless edge of a criminal mastermind. Yet even as Luciano's empire grew, he never lost sight of the human factor. Managing a sprawling network of operatives required psychological acuity. He knew which individuals were motivated by money, which by fear, and which by loyalty or ambition. Each subordinate, ally, and rival was treated as a node in a larger system, and he adjusted his approach accordingly. Some were rewarded generously to ensure obedience, others were tested, monitored, or subtly threatened to maintain hierarchy. Through this blend of strategy, psychology, and ruthlessness, Luciano created a social ecosystem in which loyalty, fear, and ambition were carefully balanced to reinforce his authority. The interconnectedness of his enterprises also created resilience. If one operation faltered due to law enforcement intervention or rival interference, others compensated, ensuring that the empire remained stable and profitable. Luciano's approach to risk management was both innovative and meticulous, emphasizing redundancy, contingency planning, and adaptability. He understood that in a volatile world of organized crime, flexibility was survival, and planning was power. By the late 1920s, Luciano's criminal network had evolved into a sophisticated, multifaceted empire. Bootlegging, gambling, and labor racketeering were no longer independent operations, they were strategic instruments of influence and wealth. Each activity reinforced the others, creating a self-sustaining ecosystem of power that extended from the docks of Manhattan to the political offices that oversaw the city. Luciano's genius lay in seeing the connections invisible to others, in integrating psychology, strategy, and operations into a seamless system, and in understanding that true power depended as much on perception and influence as on money or muscle. Through these early enterprises, Luciano demonstrated a transformative vision: organized crime could be rational, structured, and strategic, operating like a corporation yet retaining the lethal flexibility of a criminal network. He had moved beyond the chaotic, violent traditions of the old Mafia and established a model that would define American organized crime for decades to come. It was not just wealth he sought, it was control, influence, and the creation of an empire built on intelligence, strategy, and psychological mastery. As Luciano's influence expanded, the importance of allies became increasingly clear. Power in the underworld was never held in isolation, it was a networked currency, dependent on strategic relationships, mutual interests, and the careful calibration of trust and fear. Luciano's genius lay not only in identifying opportunity but in choosing his allies with precision. Among these, Meyer Lansky stood out, a man of intellect, foresight, and unshakable discipline. Lansky's financial acumen complemented Luciano's operational brilliance, creating a partnership that would become the backbone of a new criminal order. Their alliance was a marriage of strategy and ambition, each understanding the other's strengths, and together, they laid the foundations for an empire that transcended ethnicity, tradition, and geography. Another indispensable figure was Benjamin "Bugsy" Siegel, whose charisma, recklessness, and raw audacity provided a perfect counterbalance to Luciano's calculated approach. While Siegel's impulsive nature could have been a liability, Luciano recognized that boldness, when channeled correctly, could intimidate rivals and seize opportunities others would hesitate to pursue. Their collaboration demonstrated Luciano's psychological mastery. He could temper recklessness with strategy, harnessing it to expand influence while minimizing risk. Together, these alliances illustrated a fundamental principle of Luciano's rise: power was not simply amassed through force or fear but through a carefully curated network of capable, complementary individuals. Rivalries, however, were equally essential to understanding the psychological landscape of Luciano's ascent. Every alliance carried with it the shadow of betrayal, and every ally could become a competitor under the right, or wrong, circumstances. Luciano's ability to anticipate envy, ambition, and resentment became a critical skill. He maintained an almost preternatural awareness of potential threats within his own ranks, positioning loyalists, testing allegiances, and subtly manipulating dynamics to maintain control. The dance between trust and suspicion was constant, the stakes were always survival, influence, and dominance. In this delicate ecosystem, one miscalculation could unravel years of careful planning. The alliances Luciano forged were not limited to personal connections, they extended into communities, labor unions, and political corridors. These networks allowed him to coordinate activities across ethnic and territorial lines, creating a coalition that was as formidable in negotiation as it was in enforcement. By bridging gaps between previously disconnected factions, Italian, Jewish, and other immigrant groups, Luciano created a unified front capable of controlling markets, intimidating rivals, and influencing politics. His alliances were as much about integrating talent and resources as they were about psychological leverage, ensuring that loyalty and dependence were mutually reinforcing. The complexity of these relationships required careful management. Luciano employed a mix of reward, subtle intimidation, and psychological insight to maintain cohesion. He understood that over-reliance on fear could alienate allies, while excessive generosity could invite complacency or betrayal. Each figure in his network was treated according to their motivations. Some responded to respect, others to monetary incentive, and still others to the fear of exclusion or retaliation. By calibrating his approach to each individual, Luciano created a resilient network in which loyalty was earned, tested, and reinforced. Mentorship also played a significant role in these dynamics. Luciano, though ambitious and ruthless, understood the value of learning from those who had walked the path before him. Older gangsters, though often resistant to his innovations, provided lessons in strategy, influence, and the cost of miscalculation. He observed their strengths and, more importantly, their failures, internalizing these lessons to refine his own approach. This combination of apprenticeship, observation, and personal ingenuity allowed Luciano to navigate the complexities of alliances and rivalries with remarkable skill, ensuring that he remained several steps ahead of both friends and foes. The balance between alliance and rivalry reached a psychological apex in Luciano's handling of competing mafia families. He recognized that unchecked ambition among peers could lead to chaos, but he also understood that consolidation of power required careful negotiation, intimidation, and occasional demonstration of force. By positioning himself as both mediator and enforcer, Luciano manipulated rivalries to his advantage, ensuring that challenges to his authority were contained, redirected, or neutralized before they could escalate into open conflict. The psychological sophistication of this approach was unprecedented. He maintained the appearance of diplomacy while orchestrating outcomes that reinforced his long-term strategy. Even as Luciano consolidated his network, he remained aware of the broader psychological landscape of power. Reputation was a currency as vital as money or muscle, and he carefully cultivated his image among allies, rivals, and the public alike. Charisma, charm, and a subtle menace became tools of influence, signaling intelligence and ruthlessness simultaneously. Allies were drawn to his vision and respected his strategic acumen, while enemies hesitated, uncertain of his next move or the depth of his network. In this delicate interplay, psychological mastery reinforced operational dominance, allowing Luciano to expand influence without relying solely on brute force. By the late 1920s, Luciano's alliances had transformed the underworld. He had built a coalition that was unprecedented in its scale, sophistication, and integration. Allies like Lansky and Siegel became extensions of his will, each contributing unique skills while remaining aligned with his vision. Rivalries were managed with psychological finesse, turning potential threats into opportunities for consolidation or control. Through this careful orchestration of human dynamics, Luciano ensured that his rise was not only rapid but resilient, capable of weathering betrayal, competition, and the ever-present threat of law enforcement. In the end, the story of Luciano's alliances is inseparable from the story of his genius. Power, he understood, was never exercised in isolation. It was a networked phenomenon, dependent on the loyalty, skill, and psychology of others. By cultivating the right allies, managing rivalries with precision, and integrating networks across ethnic, territorial, and social lines, Luciano transformed the underworld into a system that reflected his vision, disciplined, strategic, and enduring. His ability to navigate these human dynamics, balancing trust, fear, and ambition, was as critical to his rise as his operational acumen or his strategic insight. Through his alliances, he demonstrated a principle that would define organized crime for decades: that the architecture of power is as much psychological as it is material, and that mastery over human relationships is the truest form of control. By the early 1930s, the underworld that Luciano had carefully structured was facing unprecedented pressures. Rivalries, once manageable through negotiation and calculated intimidation, were now intensifying as the stakes grew higher. Prohibition had created immense wealth, but it had also created immense competition. Each family, each faction, each ambitious figure sought to control territory, resources, and influence. For Luciano, this period was a test not only of operational skill but of psychological acuity, forcing him to navigate a web of threats, alliances, and political interference with precision and foresight. The hidden war of the Mafia was fought in shadows, where violence was both strategic and symbolic. Murders were not merely acts of vengeance, they were tools to manipulate perception, assert dominance, and maintain the fragile balance of power. Luciano understood that the optics of action were as important as the action itself. A well-executed assassination could intimidate rivals, solidify loyalty among allies, and convey control without destabilizing the broader system he had meticulously constructed. Conversely, reckless acts could ignite war, attract law enforcement scrutiny, or fracture alliances. This period demanded a delicate equilibrium between aggression and restraint, a psychological tightrope that Luciano navigated with remarkable skill. Government pressure began to mount in new and sophisticated ways. Law enforcement agencies were becoming more organized, and the media began sensationalizing crime, turning mobsters into public figures and painting the streets of New York as a battleground. The public's fascination with gangsters was double-edged. It elevated the notoriety of figures like Luciano but also drew scrutiny from politicians and prosecutors. Luciano recognized the dual nature of publicity. It could be a tool to intimidate rivals, but it could also expose vulnerabilities. He learned to manipulate information, exploit media narratives, and cultivate an image that projected both charm and menace, turning perception into a subtle weapon of control. The rise of federal agencies like the Bureau of Prohibition added another layer of complexity. Luciano's operations were under constant threat of surveillance, raids, and arrests. Yet he treated law enforcement not merely as an adversary but as a variable in the larger strategic equation. Bribes, political connections, and the careful management of informants became essential tools. Luciano's understanding of the interplay between criminal enterprise and state apparatus allowed him to anticipate enforcement actions and adapt his operations accordingly. The hidden war was as much about information, negotiation, and foresight as it was about money or muscle. Internally, the Mafia landscape was fraught with tension. Some older family heads resisted Luciano's innovations, clinging to old codes that emphasized lineage and tradition over efficiency and strategy. Others resented his rising influence and sought to undermine his authority through intimidation or secret alliances. Luciano's genius lay in neutralizing these threats without destabilizing his empire. Through a combination of diplomacy, strategic inclusion, and occasional force, he converted potential rivals into allies or eliminated them before they could act decisively. He manipulated psychology as deftly as strategy, understanding fear, respect, and ambition as levers that could be pulled to maintain control. The hidden war also manifested in subtle economic maneuvers. Control of territory, rackets, and distribution networks was constantly contested, and Luciano's operations required vigilant oversight. He deployed trusted lieutenants to monitor rival activity, gather intelligence, and respond quickly to threats. This network of operatives allowed him to anticipate moves, neutralize competitors, and exploit openings with remarkable speed. Violence was never random, it was precise, a language of power that communicated consequences while reinforcing structure and order within his own organization. Even as conflicts escalated, Luciano demonstrated an uncanny ability to maintain cohesion within his ranks. He understood that internal instability could be more dangerous than external threat. Loyalty was continually tested and reinforced through a combination of incentives and psychological pressure. Allies were rewarded for competence, subordinated figures were subtly threatened to ensure obedience, and rivalries were managed to prevent fragmentation. By maintaining this balance, Luciano ensured that his empire could withstand the pressures of both law enforcement scrutiny and competitive aggression from rival factions. Political influence played a critical role during this hidden war. Luciano leveraged relationships with politicians, union leaders, and law enforcement officials to protect his operations and expand his influence. These relationships were delicate, requiring constant negotiation and psychological acumen. The stakes were immense. A single misstep could result in raids, arrests, or public scandal. Yet Luciano's skill in managing these connections allowed him to operate with a degree of freedom unmatched by many of his contemporaries. The hidden war was as much about influence and perception as it was about violence or revenue. By the mid-1930s, the pressure of the hidden war reached its apex. Rivalries threatened open conflict, law enforcement scrutiny was intensifying, and the public spotlight added unpredictable consequences. Luciano's survival depended on his ability to integrate intelligence, psychological insight, strategic aggression, and alliance management into a seamless approach. Each decision had cascading effects. A miscalculated strike could provoke retaliation, a poorly managed alliance could fracture, and a misread political situation could invite prosecution. Yet Luciano navigated these challenges with the precision of a strategist, consistently turning threats into opportunities and consolidating influence even under immense pressure. Through these years of hidden conflict, Luciano refined his approach to power itself. He understood that dominance required not only strength but perception, adaptability, and psychological insight. Violence was a tool, loyalty was currency, and influence was a networked system that needed constant cultivation. The hidden war shaped him into a leader capable of orchestrating complex operations, managing multiple contingencies, and navigating the volatile intersections of ambition, fear, and opportunity. It was a crucible that tested his intellect, patience, and ruthlessness, preparing him for the ultimate challenges that would soon define his legacy. By the end of this period, Luciano had not only survived the hidden war but had emerged stronger, more disciplined, and more strategically aware than ever. He had transformed chaos into a system, rivalries into alliances, and threat into opportunity. The underworld, once fragmented and chaotic, had been shaped by his vision and psychological mastery. Luciano was no longer just a rising gangster, he had become the architect of an empire, a strategist who understood the hidden mechanics of power and the psychology of every individual within it. The next phase of his life, the beginning of his public downfall, would test these lessons in ways far more dramatic, exposing the tension between ambition, law, and the unpredictable forces of fate. Despite his meticulous planning and careful orchestration of power, the world Luciano had built was never completely immune to risk. The very success that elevated him to the pinnacle of organized crime also made him a target. Rival factions, law enforcement agencies, and the shifting loyalties within his own network all conspired to expose vulnerabilities. By the mid-1930s, the empire he had constructed with such precision began to show cracks, not because of external assaults alone, but because of the internal pressures that power inevitably generates. In the shadows, forces were aligning to challenge his dominance, and Luciano would soon face the first true tests of his genius and resilience. The beginnings of his downfall were subtle, almost imperceptible to those who only observed the surface of the criminal underworld. Rumors circulated, alliances began to shift, and the political and law enforcement climate grew increasingly hostile. The same connections that had once provided protection, police officers, politicians, and union leaders, were becoming unreliable either through exposure, corruption, or changing priorities. Luciano's carefully cultivated balance of influence was vulnerable, and he understood, with the acute psychological awareness that had defined his rise, that any misstep could be catastrophic. He sensed the narrowing window in which he could act to maintain control, and yet, the pressures were mounting faster than even his calculations could fully anticipate. One of the most destabilizing factors was betrayal from within. Even the most loyal allies were not immune to ambition, greed, or fear. In the underworld, loyalty is always conditional, contingent upon the perception of advantage and survival. Luciano had built a network where obedience was managed through subtle psychological manipulation, incentives, and intimidation, but even the most sophisticated systems are vulnerable to human unpredictability. Key figures began to waver, either coerced by external threats or tempted by rival factions, and the cracks in the empire's internal cohesion became increasingly apparent. It was a dangerous reminder that the greatest threats often come not from enemies outside, but from those closest to you. Rival gangsters, sensing vulnerability, intensified their maneuvers. Competition over territory, rackets, and influence became more aggressive, and minor disputes had the potential to escalate into open conflict. Luciano's response was characteristic, a combination of strategic calculation and psychological warfare. He communicated strength through both action and reputation, demonstrating that while the empire might be under pressure, its core remained untouchable. Assassinations were deployed with precision, alliances reinforced with carefully measured gestures, and public perception managed through subtle manipulation of media and social networks. Yet even with such measures, the psychological toll was undeniable. Luciano was acutely aware that every move carried consequences, and that one error could unravel years of careful planning. The looming threat of law enforcement added another layer of complexity. Investigations into his operations, surveillance, and informants created a climate of constant tension. The very networks he had built to manage risk now required constant vigilance, as legal exposure could dismantle the empire as effectively as any rival's attack. Luciano's genius was in adapting to these pressures. He cultivated legal cover, negotiated immunity, or reduced scrutiny where possible, and orchestrated events so that his operations appeared decentralized, making it difficult for authorities to pin responsibility directly on him. Even so, the weight of inevitable confrontation with the law created a psychological strain that no operational skill could entirely alleviate. It was during this period that Luciano's personal psychology became a battlefield in itself. The awareness of betrayal, the pressure of leadership, and the looming legal threats forced him to reconcile the man he had become with the myth he had created. Luciano had always thrived on control, anticipating outcomes and manipulating human behavior with precision. Now, faced with forces beyond his immediate command, he experienced the tension between ambition and vulnerability. The calculated composure that had served him so well was tested by uncertainty, revealing that even the most powerful figures in the underworld are not immune to fear, doubt, or the consequences of miscalculation. The arrest that marked the public beginning of his downfall was both dramatic and symbolic. It represented the collision of his carefully structured empire with the external forces he could not fully control. The charges, ranging from vice operations to bribery and organized crime, were a culmination of years of accumulated risk. Yet, Luciano approached the moment with the same strategic mind that had guided his rise. He understood the significance of appearances, the necessity of managing alliances even under duress, and the potential to turn adversity into leverage. His reaction was a mixture of calculated defiance and psychological maneuvering, signaling both to allies and rivals that while the game was changing, he was far from defeated. Psychologically, this period exposed the duality of Luciano's genius and vulnerability. On one hand, he remained an unmatched strategist, capable of orchestrating complex networks of influence even from positions of constraint. On the other, the arrest highlighted the limits of control. Power, as he had meticulously constructed it, could be challenged not only by rivals or law enforcement but by the unpredictable variables inherent in human behavior and institutional pressure. The tension between absolute ambition and the reality of limitation created a psychological landscape as treacherous as any physical battlefield. Even as the fall began, Luciano's mind was already planning his next moves. He leveraged relationships within the prison system, maintained influence over his operatives on the outside, and calculated the political and social pressures that could be manipulated to his advantage. The initial collapse of his freedom did not equate to the collapse of his empire. Rather, it introduced a new form of challenge, one that tested both his operational acumen and psychological resilience. The fall was underway, but it was not yet complete, and Luciano's ability to navigate the early stages of decline would prove critical to the legacy he would leave behind. By the end of this phase, it was clear that Luciano's empire, while formidable, was vulnerable to forces both internal and external. Betrayal, rivalry, and law enforcement had converged, signaling that the era of unchallenged dominance was ending. Yet, even in the shadow of downfall, Luciano demonstrated the hallmarks of his genius: strategic foresight, psychological mastery, and an unyielding capacity to turn adversity into opportunity. The tension between power and vulnerability, control and uncertainty, would define this chapter of his life, setting the stage for the courtroom battles, imprisonment, and ultimate recalibration of his influence that lay ahead. The trial of Charles "Lucky" Luciano was more than a legal proceeding, it was the culmination of years of strategic dominance clashing with the inexorable reach of the law. From the moment he stepped into the courtroom, Luciano understood that he was not merely defending himself against charges of organized crime, vice, and corruption, he was performing on a stage that would define public perception, shape the trajectory of his empire, and test the psychological mastery he had so carefully cultivated. The courtroom became a theater where law, media, and reputation intersected, each element a variable in the precarious calculus of survival. Media attention was relentless. Newspapers, radio broadcasts, and sensationalist coverage turned the trial into a spectacle, portraying Luciano as both the embodiment of criminal genius and a threat to social order. The public fascination with the Mafia amplified every detail: the luxury of his lifestyle, the brazenness of his operations, and the audacity of his alliances. Yet Luciano approached the media storm with the same strategic mind that had guided his rise. He understood that perception could be weaponized. By controlling what was revealed, managing his demeanor, and projecting confidence, he could shape the narrative to his advantage, maintaining influence even as legal authorities sought to dismantle his empire. The courtroom itself was a psychological battleground. Prosecutors framed Luciano as the ultimate architect of vice, corruption, and murder, detailing the extensive reach of his criminal network. Witnesses testified to his influence, from union manipulation to control over illicit operations. Every piece of evidence was designed to construct a narrative of omnipotence and immorality. Yet, Luciano was not a passive participant. He navigated the proceedings with a blend of composure, subtle intimidation, and strategic engagement. Lawyers were guided to emphasize legal technicalities, discredit hostile witnesses, and cast doubt on the motives of accusers, creating cracks in the seemingly insurmountable case against him. Psychologically, the trial was an arena where power and vulnerability collided. Luciano, accustomed to orchestrating outcomes from positions of strength, now faced forces beyond his direct control. Yet he adapted, leveraging human behavior, perception, and fear to mitigate the consequences. The courtroom became a chessboard. Prosecutors moved pawns, witnesses advanced narratives, and Luciano countered with strategy, poise, and selective engagement. Every gesture, every word, every measured silence was calculated to assert authority, maintain dignity, and protect the foundations of his empire, even as freedom hung in the balance. One of the most profound challenges was the moral dimension of the trial. Luciano's empire had been built on a foundation of fear, loyalty, and calculated violence. Now, these same tactics were scrutinized in the light of law and public opinion. The courtroom transformed the abstract principles of the underworld, strategic alliances, coercion, and psychological manipulation, into tangible accusations of criminality and immorality. Luciano faced the stark contrast between his internal logic of power and the external judgment of society, forcing a confrontation between the man who had mastered the streets and the moral framework imposed by law. Despite the gravity of the situation, Luciano demonstrated an extraordinary capacity to manipulate the narrative. His defense was not merely legal, it was psychological. He projected confidence, cultivated allies within the proceedings, and managed his interactions to maximize the perception of control. Even in the face of damning testimony, he remained outwardly composed, signaling to allies and adversaries alike that while the legal system could constrain him temporarily, it could not dismantle the structure of influence he had built. This psychological resilience, honed over years of navigating the volatile underworld, became one of his most potent defenses. The trial also exposed the delicate interplay between loyalty and betrayal. Allies were called to testify, some out of coercion, others from a desire to distance themselves from liability. Luciano had anticipated some of these moves, but not all. Each piece of testimony, each act of courtroom performance, became a test of his network's cohesion and his ability to maintain influence even under duress. Those who wavered threatened not only legal outcomes but the perception of invincibility that had underpinned his empire. The psychological stakes were as high as the legal ones. The trial was as much about control and reputation as it was about incarceration. As the trial progressed, it became evident that the system itself was a form of theater. Judges, prosecutors, and defense attorneys engaged in a complex interplay of power, persuasion, and procedure. Luciano observed and adapted, using the courtroom's procedural nuances to delay outcomes, challenge evidence, and influence perceptions. This sophisticated understanding of institutional psychology mirrored his approach to the streets. He recognized that human systems, whether criminal or legal, were governed by predictable behaviors, biases, and vulnerabilities. By leveraging these, he maintained a degree of agency even when physically constrained. Ultimately, the trial culminated in a conviction and a prison sentence, a public affirmation that even the most powerful figures were not immune to legal consequences. Yet, even in this apparent defeat, Luciano's mastery of perception and influence remained evident. He had survived the courtroom not only as a defendant but as a strategist, maintaining authority, projecting confidence, and safeguarding the networks that underpinned his empire. The trial marked a moral and psychological turning point. It crystallized the limits of control, exposed vulnerabilities, and tested the resilience of his vision. The aftermath of the trial revealed the duality of Luciano's empire. Legally constrained, he was nonetheless able to exert influence from prison, demonstrating that power could extend beyond physical freedom when combined with psychological insight, strategic foresight, and a resilient network of loyal allies. The trial, in this sense, was both a collapse and a continuation, a transformation that forced Luciano to adapt his methods and rethink his approach to dominance. The moral turning point was not simply about law versus crime, it was about understanding that power is multifaceted, extending through perception, influence, and the careful orchestration of human behavior. By the conclusion of this period, Luciano had learned a critical lesson: even the most meticulously constructed empire could be challenged, yet adaptability, psychological acuity, and strategic vision could preserve influence in unexpected ways. The courtroom had tested him in a domain where muscle and intimidation were irrelevant, leaving only intellect, perception, and resilience. Luciano emerged from the trial forever changed, aware of the fragility of freedom, the limits of control, and the enduring power of psychological mastery in the complex theater of influence. Luciano's imprisonment marked a dramatic turning point, not only in his life but in the evolution of organized crime itself. For many, incarceration would signify the end of influence, the collapse of a network, and the loss of control. But Luciano, ever the strategist, understood that physical confinement did not necessarily equate to a loss of power. From the confines of a cell, he continued to orchestrate operations, influence decisions, and manipulate the underworld with an intelligence that rivaled his days on the streets. Prison became a new arena for strategy, one where perception, communication, and psychological mastery were as critical as any criminal act he had previously executed. Maintaining influence from behind bars required ingenuity and adaptability. Luciano leveraged the relationships he had cultivated over years, lawyers, guards, corrupt officials, and loyal lieutenants, to remain informed of developments outside. Letters, coded messages, and intermediaries allowed him to direct operations, resolve disputes, and reinforce hierarchies within his organization. Every move was calculated, even the smallest communication had the potential to reshape alliances, prevent rebellion, or preempt threats. Luciano treated prison as a command center, recognizing that power was not merely about mobility or violence, but about knowledge, foresight, and the ability to influence human behavior across space and circumstance. The psychological aspect of control from incarceration was profound. Luciano understood that perception mattered as much as reality. To subordinates, he remained omnipresent, a figure whose reach extended beyond prison walls. This perception was reinforced through selective enforcement of orders, strategic use of intermediaries, and the occasional demonstration of subtle, yet unmistakable, authority. By cultivating the image of an untouchable and ever-watchful leader, he ensured that obedience remained consistent, loyalty was maintained, and potential challengers were deterred. Fear and respect, balanced with psychological insight, became the twin pillars sustaining his power. Internally, Luciano also had to navigate the volatile environment of prison itself. The system was not merely a backdrop but an ecosystem, populated by individuals with their own ambitions, resentments, and alliances. Guards, fellow inmates, and administrators all represented variables to be managed. Luciano applied the same principles he had honed on the streets, understanding motivations, leveraging weaknesses, and establishing dominance without provoking unnecessary conflict. By manipulating social dynamics and projecting authority, he transformed confinement from a limitation into a platform from which influence could radiate outward. Even outside of immediate operational concerns, Luciano's time behind bars was an exercise in strategic patience. He used incarceration as an opportunity to observe, to reflect, and to anticipate future moves. Decisions made in the heat of street-level crime were impulsive, decisions made from a calculated, constrained position could be refined, tested, and timed for maximum effect. Luciano demonstrated that true power was as much about the ability to wait, watch, and act with precision as it was about the immediate deployment of force. Psychological control, long-term planning, and strategic foresight became his most effective tools in navigating the new limitations imposed by imprisonment. One of the most critical challenges was maintaining the cohesion of the empire he had built. Distance, communication barriers, and the ever-present threat of betrayal required constant vigilance. Luciano relied on trusted lieutenants to execute his orders, monitor rivals, and report back. He established a system of checks and balances, ensuring that no single subordinate could act independently without accountability. This networked approach mirrored his earlier strategies on the streets, but with an added layer of complexity. Every intermediary introduced risk, and every delay could be exploited by adversaries. Luciano's genius was in structuring these layers so that control remained effective even when direct oversight was impossible. The intersection of loyalty and fear remained central. Allies were reminded, subtly yet persistently, that obedience and reliability would be rewarded, while disloyalty or negligence would not be tolerated. Luciano's psychological acumen allowed him to calibrate these incentives with uncanny precision. Some were motivated by financial gain, others by respect, and others by fear of retribution. Each individual's behavior was anticipated, monitored, and influenced in a way that maintained the integrity of the larger system. Even in confinement, Luciano's understanding of human nature allowed him to operate as the architect of a complex social and criminal ecosystem. Prison also exposed Luciano to new opportunities for influence that were less tangible but equally powerful. By cultivating relationships with officials, mediating disputes among rival factions, and offering solutions to external authorities, he positioned himself as both indispensable and formidable. He understood that influence extended beyond immediate operations to encompass negotiation, leverage, and the careful manipulation of perception. Power was no longer purely transactional, it became systemic, psychological, and pervasive, capable of extending beyond walls, guards, and bars. Throughout his incarceration, Luciano's capacity to adapt was repeatedly tested. External pressures, rival factions, and legal challenges all threatened to destabilize his authority. Yet he consistently demonstrated the ability to convert adversity into advantage. Orders were issued, alliances maintained, and perception controlled with a precision that few, if any, contemporaries could match. The empire he had built on the streets continued to function, resilient and adaptive, as a testament to his understanding that leadership is defined not by circumstance but by mastery over human behavior, strategic foresight, and psychological insight. By the time his sentence neared its eventual reduction, Luciano had achieved something remarkable. He had transformed incarceration into a proving ground for strategy, influence, and psychological control. Power, he demonstrated, is not confined by walls, it is exercised through intellect, foresight, and the careful orchestration of human behavior. His continued dominance from behind bars not only ensured the survival of his empire but also solidified his reputation as a master strategist, capable of extending authority and influence far beyond conventional limits. Prison, which might have been the undoing of lesser figures, became another stage upon which Luciano demonstrated the enduring genius of his criminal vision. Luciano's release from prison did not mark a return to the streets he once ruled, but rather a new phase of exile, reflection, and calculated reinvention. Deported to Italy in 1946, he was stripped of the physical territory and direct control he had wielded in New York, yet he remained a figure of immense influence in the shadows. Exile was both punishment and opportunity. It severed him from the immediate mechanisms of power he had built, but it also provided a vantage point to observe, recalibrate, and consider the broader implications of his life, empire, and legacy. The man who had once orchestrated an empire of crime now faced the psychological challenge of redefining identity and purpose in a world where freedom was constrained not by prison walls but by geography and circumstance. Italy, recovering from the devastation of World War II, offered a surreal backdrop for Luciano's exile. The streets were familiar yet alien, shaped by a Europe struggling to rebuild amidst political upheaval. For Luciano, this environment mirrored the internal dissonance of his position, powerful in reputation, yet disempowered in action, influential in memory, yet limited in execution. He moved through the Italian landscape as both observer and strategist, carefully monitoring developments in the criminal world he had once dominated, maintaining contacts where possible, and understanding that influence was as much about perception and legacy as it was about immediate control. Exile also became a period of introspection. The psychological toll of displacement was profound, forcing Luciano to confront the dualities that had defined his life, ambition and morality, loyalty and betrayal, power and vulnerability. He reflected on the empire he had built with such precision, recognizing the cost of dominance, lives lost, alliances tested, and trust compromised. Yet he also understood the ingenuity and vision that had allowed him to transcend the limitations of his time and environment, creating a system of organized crime unparalleled in sophistication and durability. This tension between pride and regret, mastery and consequence, became a defining feature of his final years, shaping both his actions and his legacy. While physically removed from New York, Luciano's influence persisted. Through intermediaries and loyal operatives, he maintained a degree of oversight over operations in America, ensuring that the empire he had built did not collapse entirely. This remote management required a blend of psychological insight, strategic patience, and meticulous communication. Each instruction was calibrated, each message weighed for effect, and every intermediary selected for reliability and subtlety. In exile, Luciano demonstrated that influence was not solely a product of proximity or force, it was a function of intellect, foresight, and the ability to navigate complex human networks across distance and circumstance. The Italian years also offered opportunities for engagement in legitimate endeavors, a contrast to the illicit activities that had defined his earlier life. Luciano experimented with investment, commerce, and social maneuvering, testing the potential for influence outside the strictures of criminal enterprise. These ventures were informed by the same analytical mind that had orchestrated bootlegging, gambling, and labor racketeering decades earlier, but now tempered by the recognition that risk extended beyond legal prosecution to the fragile equilibrium of reputation, alliances, and social perception. In this sense, exile was not merely a punishment but an experiment in adaptation, testing whether a mind accustomed to control could operate effectively in a new domain of limitations. The psychological transformation of exile was intertwined with a philosophical awakening. Luciano began to contemplate the nature of power, loyalty, and mortality in ways he had never permitted himself during the relentless drive of his rise. The very structures that had protected him, the networked alliances, psychological leverage, and strategic foresight, were now abstracted from immediate execution, offering a perspective on life and crime that was contemplative rather than reactive. He considered the consequences of ambition, the fragility of human relationships, and the ethical calculus that had governed both his rise and his downfall. These reflections, shaped by distance and time, infused his later actions with a nuanced understanding of human behavior, influence, and the transient nature of control. Yet Luciano remained ever aware of the power of reputation. Stories of his ingenuity, ruthlessness, and strategic brilliance continued to circulate in both criminal and public spheres. Even in exile, he wielded this intangible currency with precision, ensuring that his name remained synonymous with authority, intelligence, and strategic mastery. Reputation became a tool, a shield, and a bridge, allowing him to influence events from afar, maintain psychological dominance over allies and rivals, and secure a place in the annals of organized crime that transcended physical presence. As the years progressed, Luciano's exile became a delicate balance between reflection and engagement, contemplation and action. He navigated a world where influence was largely symbolic yet remained consequential, testing the limits of his intellectual and psychological faculties. The man who had once controlled the streets of New York now operated in the theater of perception, memory, and indirect authority, demonstrating that true power extends beyond immediacy and tangible assets to encompass strategy, insight, and the careful orchestration of human behavior. By the end of his exile, Luciano had completed a transformation as profound as any in his rise or fall. He was a man defined not only by his criminal genius but by his capacity to adapt, reflect, and manipulate influence under constraint. Exile was both a punishment and a proving ground, revealing the elasticity of power and the resilience of intellect when tested against distance, limitation, and reflection. Luciano's Italian years crystallized the duality of his life, the ruthless architect of crime and the contemplative strategist, forever negotiating the interplay between action, perception, and consequence. In this final chapter, he emerged as a figure who had transcended the streets, the law, and even his own empire, leaving behind a legacy defined as much by psychological mastery as by criminal innovation. Luciano's legacy is both monumental and paradoxical, a fusion of ruthless pragmatism, psychological mastery, and transformative innovation in the world of organized crime. The empire he built did more than control illegal operations, it reshaped the very structure of criminal enterprise, creating a model that would endure long after his death. The modern mafia owes much to Luciano's vision, a network system of influence, strategic alliances, and operational discipline that transcended ethnicity, geography, and individual ambition. He transformed organized crime from fragmented street gangs into a sophisticated, hierarchical, and highly efficient enterprise, one in which information, loyalty, and psychological leverage were as valuable as money or muscle. Luciano's influence was evident not only in the structure of the mafia but in its culture. He introduced a meritocratic approach to leadership, emphasizing competence and vision over ancestry or family ties. This shift created an environment in which the most capable individuals, regardless of background, could rise through the ranks, reinforcing the efficiency and resilience of the organization. The psychological impact of this approach was profound. Loyalty was earned through respect and results, rather than imposed by fear alone, and ambition was channeled into enterprise rather than internecine conflict. By reshaping the internal culture of the mafia, Luciano ensured that his legacy would be felt far beyond his own era, instilling principles that would guide generations of organized crime leaders. His influence extended beyond the mafia itself. The principles he applied, strategic alliances, networked control, and psychological manipulation, were mirrored in other criminal enterprises across the globe. From Latin America to Europe, and later to Asia, Luciano's model demonstrated the power of organization over chaos, foresight over impulsivity, and intelligence over brute force. His methods showed that a well-structured network, guided by psychological insight and strategic vision, could endure, expand, and adapt to changing circumstances, effectively professionalizing criminal operations on a scale previously unseen. Beyond operational innovation, Luciano left a psychological imprint on the very concept of criminal leadership. He demonstrated that true power extends beyond physical strength or immediate authority, encompassing perception, influence, and control over human behavior. Leaders are defined not merely by the territory they command, but by the loyalty they cultivate, the fear they manage, and the strategic foresight they exercise. Luciano's life offers a lesson in the nuanced interplay of psychology and strategy. Those who master human behavior and information flows can wield influence that far exceeds the limits of physical presence or temporal power. Luciano's impact also resonates in popular culture, shaping the mythos of the Mafia in ways both romanticized and terrifying. Movies, books, and documentaries have drawn inspiration from his life, portraying him as the archetype of the intelligent, calculating, and charismatic crime boss. Yet behind the legend lies the reality of a man who understood fear, ambition, and loyalty with surgical precision. The cinematic image of the Mafia strategist is inseparable from Luciano's life, and the psychological blueprint he established continues to inform both scholarly analysis and cultural imagination. The legacy of Luciano is not merely structural or cultural, it is moral and psychological, too. He forced contemporaries and successors alike to reckon with the nature of ambition, ethics, and consequence in environments governed by both law and lawlessness. His life exemplifies the tension between human ingenuity and moral compromise, between vision and destruction, between loyalty and betrayal. Psychologically, Luciano's story is a case study in the exercise of power, demonstrating the fragility and resilience of human systems under conditions of extreme stress, risk, and opportunity. The lessons embedded in his rise and fall continue to inform the study of leadership, influence, and human behavior in high-stakes environments. Even decades after his death, Luciano's methods remain relevant in understanding modern organized crime. Syndicates continue to emulate his principles of operational discipline, networked alliances, and strategic flexibility. His emphasis on intelligence over brute force, negotiation over uncalculated aggression, and psychological mastery over simple intimidation has become a template for criminal and even corporate enterprises seeking to consolidate power while managing risk. In this sense, Luciano's legacy transcends the criminal underworld, offering insights into the mechanics of influence, governance, and organizational psychology applicable to diverse fields. Yet the enduring fascination with Luciano also stems from his ability to embody dualities. He was both ruthless and visionary, feared and respected, mythologized and real. This complexity makes his story psychologically compelling. He was neither hero nor villain in the traditional sense, but a master of context, circumstance, and human behavior. His life illustrates that power is rarely absolute, it is relational, contingent, and mediated through networks of influence, loyalty, and perception. Understanding Luciano's legacy requires recognizing that he was as much a student of human nature as he was a manipulator of it, and that the architecture of control he built was as intellectual as it was operational. Ultimately, Luciano's impact is inseparable from the evolution of organized crime and the psychology of leadership. He transformed chaos into structure, ambition into enterprise, and fear into a system of controlled influence. His methods, vision, and strategic acumen created a model that endured through decades, shaping both the reality and the myth of the Mafia. Luciano's life offers a profound lesson in the interplay of intellect, psychology, and human behavior, that lasting power is exercised not only through action but through understanding, anticipating, and orchestrating the motivations of others. In the annals of criminal history, and in the study of human influence more broadly, Luciano remains a towering figure, a testament to the enduring power of strategic mind and psychological mastery. Lucky Luciano's story closes not with a single act but with the enduring echo of his influence, a man who reshaped crime, power, and perception itself. From the chaotic streets of early 20th century New York to the gilded hierarchy of the modern Mafia, he transformed fragmented gangs into a disciplined, networked empire, guided by strategic brilliance and psychological mastery. Even as his freedom was curtailed by prison and exile, Luciano demonstrated that true power extends beyond physical control, it lives in perception, loyalty, and the ability to manipulate networks of influence. His genius lay not merely in domination but in understanding human behavior, anticipating betrayal, and orchestrating complex systems that persisted even in his absence. The myth of Lucky Luciano, immortalized in movies, books, and media, often emphasizes charm and ruthlessness, but the reality is deeper and more nuanced. He was a man who combined audacity with calculation, fear with respect, and vision with pragmatism. Every decision, every alliance, every risk reflected an acute understanding of the psychological levers that govern human behavior. Even in exile, far from the streets he once ruled, his influence endured, his reputation ensuring that loyalty remained, rivals were cautious, and his legacy continued to shape organized crime globally. Luciano's life illustrates the tension between ambition and consequence. For all his success, he was subject to law, betrayal, and the limits of human control. His imprisonment and exile underscored the fragility of power and the inevitability of constraint, even for those who appear untouchable. Yet within these limits, he demonstrated resilience, strategic foresight, and adaptability, proving that influence can persist beyond freedom, and power is as much about intellect and perception as it is about action. In the final analysis, Luciano's story is a lesson in dualities: myth versus man, dominance versus vulnerability, loyalty versus betrayal, and genius versus fallibility. His life resonates not only as a tale of crime but as a cinematic exploration of human ambition, psychological insight, and the complexities of power. The man is gone, but his methods, influence, and legend endure, a haunting reminder that control is never absolute, yet mastery of perception and strategy can extend influence far beyond the reach of walls, time, or circumstance.